Okay, so now I want to give you an example of something that I use, and it's my mileage log sheet. And this is a simplified mileage log sheet here. And the way I've got it set up, one of my tricks, if you will, is that I often will highlight yellow cells that I should leave alone. They're either important headers that I don't want to edit unless I know I want to edit it, or they're calculations. They have equations in them and I don't want to change the equation, so I leave it alone. And so all of these that I have highlighted here in E4 through F17 are all equations. And then the mileage rate, well, that stays the same based on 2014 IRS business miles. It was 56 cents per mile driven was your reimbursement rate for business travel. So how does this one work? Well, I've got my mileage logs at the start of the year. That's how many miles were on the vehicle. And I'll put in my mileage log at the end of the year so I know how many miles were driven in the entire year, which is important information if you're doing mileage. The IRS might ask for that, beginning and ending miles. And certainly that's important if you are mixed miles. You're talking about a car that has personal and business use on the same vehicle. Not going to get into taxes here, but here's total miles. Very easy equation. D4 minus C4, my ending miles minus my beginning miles. And just copy that down. I just take column D value, whatever the ending miles was for that trip, minus the beginning miles. Pretty simple equation. And so these are all the different trips. And so I had a meeting in San Ardo. That was a fairly longer drive. San Ardo is not close. I had a dentist appointment, Meals on Wheels deliveries, inspections in South County, whatever. These are just kind of made up things, but not too far from potential reality. And these are the numbers driven. But there's a little bit of a problem here. If I'm not a Meals on Wheels employee, and it's a volunteer thing, I don't think you can be a Meals on Wheels employee for a delivery person. You might be. I'm not sure how it works with them. That doesn't count as business mileage. And certainly my dentist appointment, even though that might be something deductible, that's not a business deduction. So there are a couple of things here that are red flags that I can't put as deductions. But do I want to keep track of them? Well, I might say, two dentist appointments in the year, who cares? Two dentists and two doctors, it's irrelevant mileage. I'm going to just forget about it. Or maybe you want to consider that. But this table might have some problems. How do I figure out the reimbursement rate? Again, very simple. I take the mileage, make that bigger, E4, which is the calculated miles, times $I, $4. This fixed cell reference pointing to the reimbursement rate. So when I copy that equation down, it's going to be E5, E6, E7, E8. It's going to copy or change the relative reference to the next row down as I copy down, but it's going to always keep $I, $4. Always keep it pointing to the rate. Okay? Very simple, but limited mileage log. If I'm just doing business miles, this works great. I don't need anything more complicated. But if I'm doing multiple mileage, I need to have a solution. And there are different ways to do that. I could keep separate sheets for business and charity and medical. I could have 3 separate sheets. That works, but maybe it's a little too complicated, a little too annoying to have mileage data in 3 places. Or maybe I could I could have a column that identifies it as medical, dental, well, dental would be the medical, charitable, and business, which are the 3 categories that the IRS cares about: medical, charitable, and business. And there's also moving expenses as well, which would be a kind of an, hopefully you're not doing that every year, but you might have the ability to claim mileage reimbursement for a job-related move. So how did I solve it? Let's go to the second tab, mileage log categorical. So here, you'll notice that I've added a code, PWMCW, PWW. What the heck is all that? Well, P is personal. I don't get any mileage. I don't get any reimbursement. I have miles, but that is a personal drive that I, for whatever reason, wanted to keep track of, but I don't get any money for it. Medical, charitable, and work. And I could have moving expenses in there, use, MO for moving if I wanted to. But here's the mileage rates. You'll notice that the IRS has different rates, and this is 2011 in this case. So the business or work-related miles, according to the IRS back in 2011, was 51 cents per mile. If you're doing charitable work, delivering Meals on Wheels or whatever, that's 14 cents a mile. You get a much less reimbursement. But for medical expenses, you can get up to 19 cents a mile deduction on your taxes in 2011. It's a lot harder to get that these days, but if you have really, really, really high medical expenses relative to your income, you still possibly can deduct that mileage. And if you're doing a lot of driving for regular weekly treatments for something, that might be something to consider. And right now, I'm not worried about medical mileage myself because that's been taken. You've got to have, I don't know, a huge percentage, like 10% of your income spent on mileage before you can deduct it, which, whatever. So how did I solve this? Now I've got 4 categories with a simple code: personal, work, medical, charitable, and a table of reimbursement rates for each of those categories. So my mileage stays exactly the same. It stays as D4 minus C4. The ending mileage minus the starting miles gives me my miles driven. But then my reimbursement rate is this wonderfully ugly nested function. If G4, my mile, G4? Oh, G4. If G4, my code is P, then you return the result of E4 mileage times the mileage rate for P, personal, which is 0, right? Otherwise, I go to the next one. If the code in G4 is M for medical, then I return the result of E4, my miles, times my medical rate in J5. Notice the fixed reference because it's pointing to the mileage rate table. Otherwise, if it's not M, I go to the next one. If G4, the category is C for charitable, then it returns a result of E4, my miles, times $J, $6, the mileage rate for charitable. And if it's not, I still haven't got a value, I go to the next one. And if G4 is W, work, then I multiply my mileage times the mileage reimbursement rate for work. If I still don't have anything, I return invalid code. And that helps me to know if something's wrong. All right? So it just goes down one at a time in the if function. If it's personal, multiply mileage times the personal rate. If it's medical, multiply mileage times the medical rate. If it's charitable, multiply mileage times the mileage, the charitable mileage rate. And if it's work, multiply it times the work mileage rate. But if I have nothing there, invalid code. Or if I have a code that doesn't make any sense, so if it's either blank or not one of the PMCW valid codes, it gives me an invalid code. Looks ugly as heck. That is one ugly looking equation with lots of parentheses. Now, the beauty of Excel is that it color codes your parentheses so you know which parenthesis in the opening parenthesis, like this first one right here next to if, just to the right of if, is black, and it's the same one at the very, very end of this mess. The next parenthesis I run into is right here in the second if, and it closes right here. Every open parenthesis has to have a closed parenthesis. Otherwise, you're going to get a problem. If I'm missing a parenthesis, Excel's going to go, oh, wait a minute, there's an error. Something's wrong. And it's not going to let you finish. So I'm just going to hit escape. Escape is a great way to just say, whoop, don't do anything, just leave. Don't save that. Is there anything else? I do also have grand totals with equations using the sum functions, grand totals based on specific data. So sum if. Wait a minute, we talked about that. I can sum things, I can add things together, sum them like I do in this one. I'm just adding up everything in F4 through F16. Now, 14, 15, and 16 are blank, but it can handle that. It goes, well, there's nothing there, so I don't add it. But if I sum if, now I have to have a logical statement. What am I summing? If G4 through G16, anything in this G column is equal to personal, then I sum all of the things in F. So I first look at the G value. If it's a P, I add it up. If it's not a P, I skip it. And I add it up column F. Okay? And so, again, I'm looking at using another equation. This is not nested, but it is a sum if, a very good and valuable type of tool. I'm only going to add up numbers if some logical test is passed. It could be a numerical logical test, So I could say, only add up the numbers that are greater than 10, because my employer won't accept reimbursement receipts for less than that. They consider mileage reimbursement for less than 10 bucks to be irrelevant, and they won't accept it. So tiny little travel, that's your problem. It's only when it is above 10 or 5 or, whatever the number. I'm not saying that's legal or companies will do that, but that's an example where I might use sum if. Only add up the numbers that are greater than 10 or greater than 5. Only add up numbers if they're greater than 0. So negative numbers, if I've got a table that might include negative numbers and I don't want to add them, I can use sum if to only add numbers greater than 0. All the other numbers it will ignore, if that makes sense for what you're trying to do. Medical, the same thing, sum if the column G4, or excuse me, G4 through G16, if any of those equal M, then I'm going to sum column F for all of the ones that are labeled medical. Charitable, if they equal C, and work, bingo. And I've got to double check. I like to double check things. So what I did is I added everything in the column above from F4 all the way through F16, and they came up to $200.02. And then I did the subcategories of all of them by their assigned code, right? And if I add up these, if I add up F18 through 21, if I add up these, they should also add up to 200.02. If they don't, I have an error in my test. And I will do that in my spreadsheets all the time. If I'm doing nested if functions or sum if, I'll also double check my math a different way. So this one is just adding all the numbers above in F17. But in F23, what did I do? I'm summing F18 through 21, or well, it says 22. I don't need the number here. That doesn't matter. It's just a blank cell. But I'm really adding up F18 to 21 and making sure that it comes up to the same number. If this number here doesn't match this number here, I've got a mistake. If my total mileage here, adding these up, doesn't match my total mileage here, there's an error in my spreadsheet somewhere. And I got to figure out what I did wrong. Is this double check important? For me, it is, to make sure it's accurate. Is it required if everything is correct? No, it's not required. It's just my way, the way I do things. I always do things to double check myself. And I always assume I can make an error, and how am I going to catch that error? I need to figure out another way. In some cases, with these complicated cases, I need to find a second way to double check that my if functions are truly all working right. Column E uses relative cell references for mileage. Column F, in the main table, this section up here, above F16, uses both relative and fixed cell references. Column F also uses nested if functions to determine, move over, if the to determine the correct mileage rate to use, and the summary data uses the sum if function to total numbers based on the code. So again, I've got all of this information. I will also do something like this. Why not if I've got the mileage rate, where did I get it? And do I want to double check? Because this has happened at least 3 times in the last 20 years on me, where I'm doing my taxes, and I'll pull up this information and double check and realize, wait a minute, something happened. In July of the year, they changed the mileage rate. And so your mileage rate that you were using at the beginning of the year was changed due to some reason. It doesn't happen that often, but do I want to go searching again and again and again? No, I want to double check. So usually sometime in January, I will double check my mileage rate for last year. I'll look that up again, and I'll just do a quick search to make sure there were no changes during the year, that the current IRS mileage rates are really the correct one. So again, I'm showing you some tricks that I use to make sure my data is accurate. Now, do you need to know that if you're filing electronically? No, they don't ask you about the mileage rate and you don't put in the numbers directly. You just tell the IRS your total mileage. The IRS is probably just going to want to know, what are these 3 numbers right here? Your medical, charitable, and work miles, if you're trying to claim them. They'll calculate it for you. If there was a change in the middle of the year, you might have to split it out. There would be another complication. What if this data changed in July 1st? Now I need a set of mileage numbers for all dates prior to July 1st, and then another mileage rate for medical, charitable, and work for July 1st through December 31st. There's another solution. I could put a summary table halfway down. I could split it into 2 tables, or I could solve the problem using if or some if functions. I could say just, sum if the date, and nested, I could sum if the date is prior to July 31st, and sum if mileage is medical or mileage is personal, etc. Again, there are always ways to solve these problems. But I hope this mileage log example shows you a personal application of how this can work, not just an employer application, but a reason why you might want to be good at using Excel. So I hope this helps, and I hope it makes it more personal and gives you some incentive to become an Excel intermediate or expert user. If I were to give you some advice, I hopefully said this earlier in the class, but I'll repeat it. Of all the computer skills that companies want from employees, the #1 tool that they want students or employees to know is this one, Microsoft Excel. It is the most versatile, functional, and useful tool across more departments, more employment situations, more job categories than anything else by a lot. I get companies talking about Excel from all sorts of angles and all sorts of industries, not just ag, everything. If you are good at Excel, that's a feather in your cap. If you're really good at Excel, you're in demand. You might want to consider, after this class is over, if you feel that you have some computer aptitude, take other classes in Excel. Go online and do some tutorials. pay for online classes. Just learn about everything you can with Excel functions and pivot tables, and become a power user for Excel. It will make you a more efficient employee, if nothing else. It'll give you confidence, if nothing else. And it will make you more valuable in industry in general. It is hugely, hugely valuable. All right, enough said. I'll call it quits for now.